Hey, everybody. Thank you, first off, for joining the RetroTech Patreon page. This is one of the rewards that is unlocked once you join the Patreon. It is my exclusive presentation that I wrote in November of 2019 on retro gaming on a CRT. Now, this has been given at a couple conferences live, but I wanted to go ahead now and do the entire presentation here on a screencast for you as, again, a reward and to say thank you for joining the Patreon. So, again, this is my retro gaming on a CRT masterclass, and I'm going to go through this presentation in full as if you're my audience today at an event, for example. Just a little bit of a brief history about RetroTech if you're not aware. We originally were founded in 2015 and started by working on mostly gaming console repairs and modifications. And then in 2016, really started working on restoring and repairing CRTs primarily. Started the YouTube channel in June of 2018. And as of today's date, towards the end of 2019, we've restored over 200 CRTs. I do have a mission statement, which is resurrecting vintage technologies for the modern world. Today's presentation, here's a breakdown of what we're going to be covering. Okay, it's going to be first, we're going to go through a little bit of the history of the CRT, and we're going to look at, of course, then different types of CRTs. And I'm going to break down a lot of the current uses for CRTs and their benefits, and then we'll go into depth on what to look for if you're trying to buy a new CRT, and why CRT restoration is, of course, important. And since it's just a presentation here, there will not be the live Q&A session. All right, so my picture might be in the way of some of these facts, but I'm going to go ahead and read this to you a little bit. This is the history of the cathode ray tube. So cathode rays were actually discovered in the mid-1850s by two men, Julius Plücker and Johann Wilhelm Hittorf. And those are these two gentlemen you see on the screen here. These scientists studied electrical currents and discovered that they could be used in glass vacuum tubes to trap, or they could use glass vacuum tubes to trap cathode rays and project a shadow at one end of the tube. So that was the earliest uses of and it goes all the way back to 1850. Then you fast forward a few decades, and towards the end of the 1800s, Arthur Schuster uses an electric field to make a deflection area, which just means to spread out his picture on the end of his tube. And then 1897, William Crookes uses a magnetic field to make a deflection. And then finally in 1897, J.J. Thomson, the man on the very far edge of the screen over here, he proves that cathode rays are made of subatomic particles known as electrons. So he actually used a cathode ray and a cathode ray, or one of these original tubes, to prove that subatomic particles existed, and that's where the study of the electron was born from the CRT. So in 1897, a new CRT actually is made, and I've got a picture of it right here. It's called the Braun tube, and it's made by Ferdinand Braun. It is a phosphor-coated screen. It is a cold tube, but how it works is you'd attach an electrical current down to this end and you'd send it through, and you'd basically see how you could manipulate the current, or you could test basically what kind of current you had coming off leads, how stable it was, or measure it. So that was the very first tube that was ever made. And then 1922, Western Electric sells a CRT. So we have John Johnson and Harry Weinhardt. John Johnson's the man in the picture. Harry Weinhardt worked for Western Electric. They developed the first hot cathode ray tube, just meaning there was actually electrical power used in the tube the entire time as it was turned on. It's sold as a commercial product later that year. So this is something that would have been more of a vacuum tube with a beacon light in it, maybe, that was used for military codes, maybe SOS, other kind of small, just industrial purposes, not an actual television screen. In 1925, there's a gentleman, Takayanagi, He unveils a CRT with 40 lines of resolution. So he was really a genius working behind the scenes on his own CRT. 1927, he improves the resolution to 100 lines, which most people cannot match at the time. In 28, he's actually able to put the first human faces on the CRT screen. And in 1932, at the same time, RCA is granted a trademark for the term cathode ray tube and begins developing test units. And then fast forward to 1950, RCA will release that term back to the public domain. But here is a picture, or some pictures, of the very first RCA trial set that they came up with. It's a pretty interesting design. Lots of size here, a lot of wood. And the way it actually worked is you had this round CRT screen. And if you see in the third picture here, you can see a little bit better. Somewhat in the first picture you can. But there's actually a mirror on this lifting piece of wood that would have been covering the screen originally. You lift that up and there's a mirror there, and that's how you'd watch your picture. Your screen would reflect off that mirror, and that's how you'd watch anything on that set. Now, RCA didn't actually sell the first CRT TV sets. That was Telefunken, and those were commercially made CRT TVs, black and white, produced in Germany, and the first ones were made in 1934. Here are some pictures of those early televisions. This one actually on the top left has 180 TV lines, so they are improving the resolution on them, but they're still mammoth in size, and most of the time they looked like furniture, more really than appliances. So again, these are the earliest sold televisions. They would have all been black and white. So if you go through the period now of the 30s and 40s and into the early 50s, it's all black and white television at this point. And CRT, however, that technology becomes more and more popular, and more homes all over the world, and especially in America, begin to have more and more black and white televisions in them. RCA, who we talked about previously, they have the major market share for CRTs at this time, and that's over half the TVs that were sold were made by RCA. RCA was also able to develop a color television technology called shadow mesh technology, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail. That was towards the end of the 40s into the early 50s was when they were really working on that. And then fast forward towards the mid to late 50s, and television broadcast is finally television signals were broadcast in color for the first time. And after that happened, you really had a sharp move towards color TV sets, because in the early 60s, color TV sets, the sales skyrocket and really leave the black and white sets behind. So we talked about the very first color TVs that RCA had made, and these are just some pictures of those. You'll notice a very rounded tube on these, on the edges. So it's a very circular almost picture, but still they were color, and they were using a shadow mask technology. And then if we fast forward, we're going to look at some more CRTs that RCA was still dominating this market in the 1960s. And the design still has a lot of wood, but they've gone away from that circular design and made more of a larger tube, too, that is almost angular on the edges. Now, here's how this shadow mask technology worked. And this is the original shadow mask technology. So they had these 3 electron guns generally set up in a triangular pattern, and those would individually shoot a color beam, and that color beam would hit the shadow mask, which would then realign the dot pattern on your screen in layman terms. So the original color beams, again, were not as effective in that triangular pattern. So as you look at some real life shadow mask guns and tubes here, these are in a straight triad pattern, which was later done to improve the brightness on the TVs, because the triangular pattern was just not as bright as it needed to be. Let's just look at some of those CRT electron guns and the shadow mask tube technology. Shadow mask CRTs were produced for the entire lifespan of the CRT display. You could tell a shadow mask tube by the way the glass is curved. See how it's curved on pretty much all axes, meaning top to bottom and side to side. In 1960, Sony also tried to enter the television game, and this is their first television right here that was a 8-inch black and white unit known as the TV8 301. It's non-projection, all-transistor television. Of course, it was discontinued 2 years later due to poor sales, and it was very prone to break down. But here are some more higher detailed pictures of those original Sony televisions. They look more like spotlights, but they were definitely receiving black and white television sets. So 1961 to 64, Sony starts to try to develop a color CRT. In 1961, Sony executives went to a trade show in New York, and they stumbled across a booth for a small company called Autometric. And Autometric had designed a Chromatron color CRT that used a single electron gun instead of that 3 electron gun beam, or 3 individual guns that the Shadow Mask would use. And they also used a different kind of vertical grill that was electrically charged instead of a Shadow Mask. So Sony loved it. They immediately began to develop a Chromatron TV set with Paramount Pictures. And then in 1964, they unveiled the first Chromatron colored CRT TV set and then began to produce it. To be competitive in the marketplace, this television was sold at a large loss in hopes that Sony could eventually bring those costs down and offset that. So originally it was sold at about half the price it took to make it. So they really wanted to get in the market. Here are some pictures of that very first color Chromatron television. And Sony, however, was not successful with this television. It was still very expensive to produce. They were not able to streamline those production costs. And by 1966, they were really struggling and hemorrhaging money, and they were going to have to discontinue the whole Chromatron brand. And more competitors began to even enter the Shadow Mask TV set under the RCA license. So RCA was getting royalties and other payments. And these companies were Toshiba, Panasonic, and others. And those were notably 2 of the higher quality companies that stayed in the TV market. Sony is forced to redesign their CRT to be able to even stay in the market by the end of 1966. So during that time, they maintained 30 staffed engineers, and they tried to take and develop an alternative to the Chromatron tube. But they wanted to kind of maintain the same style of the Chromatron tube, but they knew the Chromatron tube was too expensive. So if you fast forward to the end of 67, they had really made some major developments and advancements on a new CRT gun, which had stayed with that single electron beam. And then it was separated by 3 individual cathodes after that. And then it had a brand new design aperture grill, still electrically charged. So there were some elements of the Chromatron that were still in use. However, this new Trinitron was a completely redesigned, new update for the tube, and it was a breakthrough. It was, of course, a huge product that helped Sony really, differentiate themselves in the market. They had designed the final CRT design was finished in 1968, and this product was a unique enough product to have its own patent. And the new Sony tube was named the Trinitron again from the root word Trinity. Okay, and that was the union of the 3 electron guns into the single electron gun, and then Tron taking the root word electron. So this is the first KV 1310 color TV from 1968. Now, Sony's new Trinitron outperforms all the other competition's CRTs on the market. And right at the beginning, when they made the Trinitron, the screens were brighter, needed less adjustment after production, and eventually they became cheaper to reproduce than Shadow Mask CRTs. And Sony basically dominated the CRT market with the Trinitron for the next 40 years. That's how great of a product it was. The Shadow Mask technology is still used during this time in competition with Sony. Sony tubes are curved on one edge and flat along the other, so they're not the same in design or look as a Shadow Mask tube. It wasn't till their patent expired in the mid to late 90s that the competitors really started to make major advancements in shadow mask technology that once again rival Trinitron in quality. So it really took them till those late 90s, early 2000s when they could make some really great shadow mask tubes to finally catch up with the Trinitron. So here are some of the 1970s Trinitrons. A lot of wood there, but you can tell how Sony has really made it sharper corners on the picture, and that really helped with their picture on there. And then we're moving to the 80s where we've got a little bit more of digital buttons and things like that, but then we're still keeping the wood grain. And we move into the 90s where you're going to introduce a lot of plastic, and Sony also starts making these Trinitron CRT computer monitors. Okay, so we've got all these different style of plastic televisions, and then 2000s is the last generation of CRTs, and we're looking at getting some really crazy CRTs like flat screen, wide screens, and HDMI inputs. But we also were given some really great CRTs as well as some amazing Sony computer monitors. The modern uses for CRTs. Well, there's always going to have CRTs in arcade cabinets. Sometimes they will switch over to LCDs, but they are there. Retro video games and all analog video game consoles use them. You're going to have VHS, DVD, Laserdisc. Basically, any old school analog video is going to look better on a CRT. Now, retro PC gaming or retro PC use, modern gaming on high-end CRTs. And then we got any streaming of 4:3 aspect ratio content. And of course, we're going to be using them as test signal, watching test signals through like an oscilloscope. Why are CRTs best for retro gaming? So I've got a list of 8 major points here, but basically there's no lag or latency. Consoles are usually easy to connect to these older school TVs. Light guns work on CRTs. Retro gaming consoles look better on CRTs. And I put down nostalgia because for me growing up, I always played video games on a CRT, so that's kind of part of the whole experience is playing on a CRT. Now, I didn't get to play on these high-end CRTs, but still, it's much better than a flat screen to me. Retro gaming on a CRT can be cheaper at the beginning because if you move from consumer-free TVs or very cheap consumer TVs up to higher-end monitors, you know how much more expensive it is. They're easier to use for CRT and retro gaming instead of a scaler. You don't have to have any firmware updates or anything like that generally for the most part. Better screen picture controls and picture quality is still generally better for older video content. Again, CRTs are designed specifically for analog video. Most consumer CRTs and pro video monitors only display 240 or they'll display these CRTs 240p and 480i video resolutions. Higher end pro video monitors, which most of you know about, will go from 240p all the way up to 1080i. We have digital video resolutions start at 480p and above. That can be displayed on like a VGA CRT monitor or a computer monitor that's a CRT. Nearly all flat screen TVs and monitors don't support 240p or 480i video resolutions really well, at least not the modern, most newly designed TVs and monitors. And low-quality scalers and flat-screen video processors can add a lot of lag to your display. So that's just why CRTs are basically better when it comes to using analog TVs. So what's the disadvantages of CRTs? Well, first, you do get a little bit more power consumption. That's not really a huge deal. But they are big and heavy and have a large footprint for the size. I mean, because you're basically talking about having the largest display available of probably 36 inches, a couple inches more than that sometimes, but most of the time 36 inches is the max. And that's a huge size for a CRT. It takes up a lot of space. 480i flicker, some people complain about that. There's also a high frequency noise that can come from transformers, specifically the flyback transformer. And that's not, not everybody can hear that, but some people can hear it. And they can't display digital video signals generally, and they can need repairs because most of the time the good ones even are pushing almost 20 years old at this point. So what do you look for if you're trying to go out and find your own CRT? And I've got just some really basic tips here, but the first one is, does it work? You got to power test it and see, how does the screen look? Do all the colors display on it? What brand is it? I know that might sound kind of silly, but if you're looking at just a consumer CRT, you're going to want to try to stay within the really top brands. What inputs does it have? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what screen size best fits your situation too? You need to think about, you can get something small like a 5 or 8 inch just to have test purposes or to take with you places to test things. But again, if you want something big, you can go all the way up to 36. What year was it made? So that will also help you determine on how good the picture quality is, as well as the age of the components inside. So we should be considering all that when we're looking at some CRTs. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the inputs that we're going to have on these consumer CRTs first. These are going to be specific for video inputs and retro gaming. RF is available on pretty much all consumer CRTs, but it's also going to give you the worst quality. Then one step up from that is composite AV, which is the yellow inputs there. And that's what have been added in the late 80s, early 90s as a standard to most televisions. S-Video was a giant leap forward in quality because it was separating the chroma and luma lines on the video input, and it greatly increased the picture. And that was in the 90s. And then towards the end of the life, you had component/color stream video, which actually separated each of the main colors out into component, where it was red, green, and blue, offering the highest analog video quality available. So I've got some examples here of backs of CRTs. This one on the bottom has a lot of inputs. It's more of one of the modern Sonys. So there you've got, it's really easy to see what you've got. You've got S-Video and everything pretty much there. And then the top one, though, this is more common on what you might see in the higher end Toshiba or even JVCs. And this is a very good one. It doesn't use the same, this is what it'll be labeled color stream usually. It'll have this green, blue, red, and then your audio breakout. So this is a really desirable one. And then in the middle was just S-Video and composite only. So let's talk about the best brands for Sony Trinitrons. And just going back to the inputs for 1 second, you're most likely not going to want to get a TV that just has anything. It has to at least have S-Video most of the time for it to be really even worth getting. So here's some of the earlier Sonys. Their best years were 1996 for the most part up to 2005. Some other general tips are stay away from widescreen CRTs, consumer CRTs that is, not all widescreens, and CRTs with HDMI inputs. They generally don't work well. Here's some of the best shadow mask consumer CRTs that were made towards the middle 2000s, early 2000s. There's the Toshiba A or AF series, and that one's a 32-inch. You see in the picture right there. That's an excellent consumer CRT. And then they've got some JVC-D series here, and that's going to be available in black or silver. And those CRTs are very nice too. They actually go all the way up to like 750 TV lines on a consumer set and support all the components, component, S-Video, all the goody inputs that you want. So let's go again now and start jumping into the best CRTs ever made. So from the late 1980s till the mid-2000s, many companies in the CRT industry produced commercial-grade CRT monitors. These pro video monitors were developed for 3 industries: the medical field, the film and TV production industry, and then security or closed-circuit television. These pro CRT monitors often cost 10 times or more the price of a normal consumer set. The pro-level monitors provided superior picture performance. They are also completely adjustable and were pretty much unrivaled for quality at the time. Pro CRT monitors today are preferred for retro gaming. These monitors offer the same inputs as some of the best consumer CRTs, but then they add in RGBS input. Okay, that's red, green, blue, sync. RGBS is the absolute highest quality, best analog video signal input available. Also, these CRTs, these Pro monitors tend to support more than just NTSC video. They can support PAL, sometimes even more than that, like CCAM and other regions of video format. However, RF is generally not going to be supported on any monitor, and you'll see it dropped from most of these. So Pro CRTs have a higher TV line count, providing a sharp image, deeper color, nice scan lines. These are some pictures of just some Super Nintendo and Genesis sent through just the RGB input into some Sony PVMs. All right, so let's get into the Sony PVM and BVM first. This was a leader in commercial professional video monitors, and they were in both commercial and consumer. Sony was, okay? So they produced the Professional Video Monitor Series, or PVM for short. These specific monitors were used in medical, security, and by smaller professional video editing firms. And then Sony did produce medical PVM monitors that were also branded as Olympus monitors. That would have been under Olympus OEV. And Olympus, they didn't make their own CRTs. First, they used Panasonic, and then they switched to Sony in the mid-90s. Sony also produced a line of BVM, or broadcast video monitors, that these monitors were extremely expensive, were used to edit movies, music videos, TV shows, and used in live broadcasts. And these were the best of the best pretty much for the time. They were able to offer some of the highest resolutions and supreme picture quality available, okay? And they still do that today if they're tuned up right. So here are just some examples of first PVMs, and these would be all analog-only PVMs, so none of these will be able to go over 480i. But first you've got a 1354Q, which would have been used more in a editing situation or a control room for like a TV station. Same thing with this 8044Q on the right. Now this one may have been used like in the field as a test monitor on site for news or something, for example. The PVM 2030 would have been used for all kinds of different things because it was so versatile, and its look was a pretty desirable look with the black cube, but it would have been used from anything from universities to medical labs to all kinds of stuff. And then the PVM 20M2 was specifically, this MDU is specifically a medical unit. They would have generally been white or cream in color. So let's talk about some BVMs really quickly. BVMs tend to, again, need more equipment and are definitely a little more complex than just a PVM. So here's a BVM 20 F1U. Now this one and all the rest of these don't, again, support digital video. These are just analog BVMs, but these would have higher line counts, up to like 900, almost 1,000 TV lines. This 14M4DE is a very nice BVM because it's got the same footprint style as a PVM, because most of the time BVMs are larger in size even than the PVM. And so then we've got an 8-inch BVM, and there's a look at the back of the BVM where you can see it's just a lot more metal. There's a lot of input slots back here where you have to have input cards to have the monitor function properly. And then there can be different types of build outs on these BVMs, where here we have the control card built into the bottom, but that's actually taken a specific kit to do that. They're generally sold as just the monitor without even controls. Let's talk about some Shadow Mask Pro CRT monitors. First we have JVC, which you could see in the picture here. That's a JVC monitor. And we also have Panasonic, Ikegami, and NEC. These were pretty much the biggest companies that made the most Shadow Mask Pro video monitors. And then some examples here in the bottom corner behind my face is this TM1417R. That's just an older Ikegami. Above it we have a Panasonic version of a Pro monitor, and then we've got the TMH150CG, which is a JVC monitor. All these are just analog only, no digital support for these three monitors. But this XM29, it's a pretty good CRT. It does have a much larger screen. It's NEC branded, as well as it will support 480p. Now let's talk about multi-formats Pro CRTs just for a few minutes. These Pro CRTs are the best of the best. They support video signals from 240p all the way up to 1080i. And as well as have all the other features of the Pro video monitors, they get up to 1,000 TV lines in resolution on the top models. Some have even widescreen formats. And the build quality was absolutely superior to everything else. And monitors do need maintenance and are very complex. They do require external controllers, video cards to operate, and are much larger than standard Pro monitors. So I don't generally tell people to just jump into these Pro monitors because, look, so for example, this one right here does not have a control board built into it on my picture here. So if you did not know that, you could just buy it and know that you wouldn't even be able to really control anything, switch any, make any adjustments to this monitor without a separate control board. But that's pretty much the way it is for most of these monitors. Now, there is one that's a PVM that's very easy to use. That's this 20L5, and that's a very desirable one. Again, these all going to have that 240p all the way up to 1080i support. And then you've got some D series or some widescreens here. The top one is the D series. That goes from 9-inch, 14-inch, 20-inch, 24-inch, and even a 32-inch widescreen max size. This D series is one of the most desirable monitors in the world right now because it's able to support so many different types of video signal, and it's just such a great picture. Again, the PVM is only available in 20-inch and 14-inch sizes, so no widescreen on that monitor. There is a Sony BVM A series, which was the last broadcast video monitor series line made, and that comes in a 14, 20, and 24-inch, a 32-inch widescreen. No 9-inch size there, but it had everything else. Now, the problem with this monitor is the lack of availability of parts, is you won't be able to get an analog video input card very easily for this A32, so most people end up staying away from that. There are some others, Shadow Mask, again, monitors that support over 480i, and these are those Ikegami sets. First, we have a 2005R, which is a 20-inch, and we have a 1505RA, which is a 15-inch. And this is if you want to pause and take a look at some of the statistics here, but these are both high def and also analog video monitors, and they do most everything that the Sonys do. And some people really swear by their screen picture quality, say it's better than the Sonys. So those are really the best of Ikegami's broadcast monitors. And there's also some JVC DTV series monitors that will do multi-format or go over that 480i threshold and show the higher 1080i up to that resolution. And these are those models. It comes in a 19 and a 17-inch. And then lastly, on the CRTs, let's take a second to talk about just pretty much the top PC CRT for modern gaming. This was becoming very popular. It's a Sony GDM FW900. This specific one has a 16:10 aspect ratio. And then you can see the native resolution here, as well as these refresh rates and everything. But just note that that really outperforms LCD screens, so that if you're using computer screen or really any kind of LCD screen as your hookup for your modern gaming console or modern PC, well, this one might have a better look to it due to, you're not going to get motion blur or anything like that. So since that is such a high quality CRT, this one's highly sought after. So, I mean, we're talking about these highly sought after monitors. They're pushing, over $3,000 in the marketplace right now. Best places to find CRTs. Well, first you got to check with your family or friends, and you look at online local marketplaces such as Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, OfferUp, etc. Here's a couple of online social media communities that specifically have listings for CRTs for sale if you're looking for some. So check out this Reddit page and check out this Facebook page. Both of them sometimes have monitors for sale, especially that Reddit page. eBay still sells online. There are local government auction websites. This is the one for me in Nashville, for example, and I have found CRTs and PVMs on there before. So check and see if you have some kind of eBid or other government auction site local for you. And pro CRTs can still be found at TV and news broadcast stations, medical facilities, and recycling companies. But those can be tricky to get your foot in the door with. So you got to reach out and try to, I mean, especially the TV and news broadcast stations, that's still a pretty good place to find CRTs. Why CRT repair and restoration is important. So, if you've already watched this channel for a while, you definitely know how important it is to repair things, because just like in these pictures up here, you can see a lot of dust and grime built up, and that will act as an insulator and heat up your parts and cause things to fail. But also these capacitors, they're all busted and failing already. You can see they're bulging. Some of them may have even oozed out some of that fish oil onto the board, and then that heats up and gets a big mess. So it's always good to go in here and change these things, because they're not meant to last forever usually, especially the vital ones and the ones that are in the high heat area. Now, Sony and these other companies did use really high quality parts, but if you're looking at like CRTs that are consumer sets, there still could be some bad caps in there, and I always recommend people open up their PVM or BVM or any other monitor to at least inspect inside and blow out a lot of that dust, brush off all this with some brushes and get rid of it. But basically the main reason too, one of the biggest reasons, is preserving the format and the hardware. So that's one of the important things about why CRT restoration and repair is important, is because we want to be able to keep these machines around for the next generation and have a good alternative to just trying to figure out what to do with analog signals than just try to scale them up to high def. But the other big issue with CRTs is e-waste. And pretty much all electronics from our age is going to be e-waste. So if we now look for a second on this e-waste issue, in 2006, the EPA designates CRTs that are marked for disposal. Those are considered hazardous waste due to the lead in the funnel of the glass tube. Now, there's also dangerous phosphors in the screen, but the main concern for the EPA was the lead in the funnel of these glass tubes. And they encourage recycling or reuse. And then but the disposal regulations differ per state, and the real regulations come down to your individual area. And CRTs are expensive and hazardous and difficult to recycle. You have to break them all down. They take up, again, a large amount of space. They're not easy to get into. There's a lot of manual labor that goes into ripping one apart just to scrap it or recycle it. So it ends up becoming a big sore thumb for most of these recyclers, because, again, it takes up a huge amount of space. It's so manually intensive to break down, and then there's still nothing that they can do with the glass, at least in the United States. So unfortunately, most of this stuff, our old monitors and TVs, end up in landfills, or they shipped overseas to third world countries. And then the metals are just thrown into these big scrap areas where people go in and they try to scrap the dangerous metals out of these old CRTs and other broken down electronics from the Western world. Now, this is a terrible picture to look at here, but most CRTs end up smuggled to places like this, and they end up being scrapped by children. And if you look in detail here at this picture, you'll notice he's out here pretty much barefoot, scrapping through all this stuff. There's a bunch of CRTs that have been broken open. Specifically, this goat and him, they're working on, there's a CRT right here, CRT plastic right here. And then if you notice, I've zoomed in over in this area, and this is a lot of broken glass. So a lot of that lead broken glass just sitting there. Here's some water. I'm sure this is next to like a waterway. And he's actually got a metal tray here, and that appears to be a giant shadow mask that's been pulled out of the glass from one of these broken tubes. And now he's just filling it with whatever he can scrap. So personally, I don't want to, I want to do my part to try to preserve these machines and keep them out of this situation too, if possible. I don't want to end up having them end up there. And if I do have to get rid of one, I want to make sure I recycle it to the proper place. But hey, the good news is there are still plenty of great CRTs available, and every retro gamer should own at least one, and maybe more, like my friend here in this picture. And but that's pretty much it for this presentation, guys. Thank you again so much for your support on Patreon. And again, this is going to be an exclusive presentation, so if you have any questions or comments, please make sure you send me an email, send me a message through Patreon, or post directly onto the Patreon page. And maybe within the next year, I'll develop another CRT presentation that's going to be a little bit more in depth and have more of kind of, this is a lot of beginner information, still a lot of good information, but a lot of beginner information too. So maybe in a future, another presentation will be ready that has more technical info. But that's it for today. Thank you again. I'll see you guys next time with some more retro content.